So why don't we kick things off? So the title of this webinar, The End of OTP, How to Use Behavioral Biometrics to Modernize MFA and Grow Revenue. And so thanks for joining us, John. So who are today's speakers? So I'll start by introducing myself. So my name is Mitul Parmar. So I'm the Director of Product Management and I run corporate development here at Prove. And I'll turn it over to John to tell us a little bit about himself and his background. We just acquired UnifyID. So in case you guys haven't seen the press releases and the LinkedIn job changes and some of the articles that are out there now, we're very excited to welcome UnifyID into the Prove family. So John, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Mitul. Yeah, so I'm John Whaley. I am founder and CEO of UnifyID. I've been working in security for at least the last 20 plus years now. So prior to UnifyID, I founded a company called Mocha 5, and we did enterprise security, security based on for enabling like bring your own device type programs, things like that. So as part of all of that, we had a lot of experience in getting the consumerization of IT and that tension between security and user experience. Before that, I was at Stanford. I did my PhD at Stanford. I taught at Stanford as well. I was a visiting lecturer there for a few years. Before that, I was at IBM Research, and then before that, I was at MIT and did my undergrad and master's there. So great to be on, and great. And yeah, like Mitul mentioned, we're just just acquired by Prove, and we're very, very excited about the future and the possibilities.
Yeah, we're very lucky to have you guys. So really quick, in case folks are new to Prove and UnifyID, I'll just give you guys a 30-second pitch on what Prove does. So Prove is an identity authentication and verification company that centers all interactions around the phone number. So everything we do, we think the phone number is the center of the universe when it comes to identity authentication and verification. And so our goal is to enable digital commerce and secure digital life. We do that for 1,000 enterprise customers today, 500 banks, 9 of the top 10 US banks. And we're really excited to add in the capabilities that UnifyID brings. So if you want to give a 15-second, 30-second spiel on what UnifyID does, I think that'd be really helpful to set the context.
Yeah, so we're also very mobile focused. So we make an SDK for any, you can link it to any iOS or Android app. It gives us access to the sensor data, and then you can use that to analyze your behavior and then understand whether it's who is the person behind the device, leading to a much more streamlined user experience. And so we use factors like, the way that you walk or the way you hold your phone, or a number of other things that make you very unique. And it's 100% passive. It doesn't require any conscious user action. You can just be yourself, and there's enough that's unique about you that we can actually authenticate you.
Yeah, and so Prove offers two, buckets of products: digital onboarding and digital servicing. And so we look forward to you enhancing our product offerings. So why don't we move into today's topic for the webinar? So is it the end of one-time passcodes? What do you think, John?
Yeah, well, I mean, so one-time passcodes. This is still the predominant method of doing MFA. And everybody, everyone knows, everyone has experienced these things. Like, you receive a text message with some 6-digit code that you have to type in, and there are a number of downsides to the way that this is implemented. So number one, the most of the time when you're delivering these one-time passcodes or these OTPs, you're doing it via SMS, and SMS is not a good way to actually deliver these things. I mean, you have to do it out of necessity because there aren't many great channels to be able to communicate something out of band with the user to verify they're in possession of that device or that phone number. But fundamentally, SMS is not secure. I mean, it's built on this SS7 protocol that is not encrypted and is not authenticated, and it's fun. And this is a fundamental issue. There's no way to bolt on any type of security on top of that because the protocol itself is fundamentally insecure. And we see lots and lots of hacks that are happening. These are not just one-off things. These are now happening at scale. I mean, these type of things like man-in-the-middle type of attacks. I mean, I'll give one example. I mean, of which there are many, many of these examples, but very common example is that, you may receive a phone call, where the caller ID says, oh, this is from Bank of America. And so you answer it. And then the person on the other end of the line says, oh, hello, I'm from Bank of America. We've seen some suspicious, activity in your account. And they do say some things that kind of get you worried a bit. And then they say, well, first we need to verify your identity. We just sent you, a code. Can you tell me what that code is? Right. And then so sure enough, then you get an SMS and it has like one of these 6-digit codes in there. And so you tell the person on the other end of the line, and then they say, okay, yeah, well, thank you for verifying your identity. And then they'll start to read off things like transactions that you've done recently and things like that. And then at that point, you're fully bought in because you believe that, I'm talking to the real Bank of America. Little do you know, you're actually talking to a hacker who is just sitting there in the middle, who just, did a password reset, for example, to try to get into your account, got into your account, was able to even see things. And then of course, like once they've social engineered you, then they say, well, okay, yeah, we see these fraudulent charges. We'll don't worry, we'll take care of you. We're going to transfer your money to a new account. You're going to receive your new card information in 3 to 5 business days. Don't worry if you see a notification that says all your money is being transferred, because you know exactly what that is. I just told you, and
yeah, those are super common. Right? As someone who worked in the blockchain space for a couple of years, a number of my friends that have been SIM swapped and cleaned out of their wallets is astronomical. But how do we get here, right? Because it wasn't designed. SMS wasn't designed to be like the method by which you get something that verifies your identity and authenticates you back into an account. I think this has become a real problem because your SMS traffic is now powering resets for various passwords or changing information on all these accounts. So I'm not even sure that, the mobile carriers intended for SMS to become such a pervasive channel.
No. I mean, look, NIST, so like the standards body that defines many of the security practices, they stopped recommending SMS for kind of OTP, like for 2FA, back in 2016, and it's been deprecated for a long time. Now, the reality of the situation is that there's not that many other great alternatives. I mean, the nice thing about SMS is like if you can just get the person's mobile phone number, you can send them an SMS, and it's it's generally available in most countries, et cetera. So it has taken off, and there's a lot of, it's in widespread use. It still is today, the number one form of 2FA or multi-factor authentication. But it's not recommended anymore. I mean, they explicitly say this is deprecated. Do not use this, and it's just a matter of time. Just within the next 1 to 2 years, you're going to start to say that like this is no longer an acceptable form of 2FA authentication. And for all the reasons you mentioned, it's like it's not secure, it's not authenticated. There's a SIM swap problem, like you mentioned. There's a lot of issues with it. And so, I mean, that's really the first piece of why SMS based OTP is not going to be the predominant method of authentication in the future. I mean, another reason is that SMS it's pretty expensive, especially when you go outside the US. The US, the delivery, the cost for delivery are not quite as high, but like especially internationally, it's quite expensive. The delivery rates are not great. You have to work with different providers, et cetera. It's the SMSs are a mess, and they end up being quite expensive. And then finally, and most importantly, like SMS based OTP is just a poor user experience. I mean, it delays your login, increases your abandonment rate. It's not very scalable to if every single service you're doing is like, you're just doing this for every single service, it's just not a very scalable solution either. Mm-hmm. And, this ties into, like this, like why does SMS OTP or like, this type of out of band kind of authentication hurt your revenue, right? And I mean, ultimately, these are additional steps in your flow, and then every single step you have that's increasing, that's another source of abandonment, like through your flow. I mean, and I think this happens quite often. I mean, so it's, somebody tries to log in and then it's like, oh, okay, let me get my phone so I can get my SMS code. And then you open up like, oh, my friend texted me. Oh, I better text them back. Right. Oh, I have this DM on Instagram. And then pretty soon they're sidetracked. I mean, like, there's the whole, attention economy, and that where they're hyper, like once you kind of open an app or something on your phone screen, like they got their talons in you, and it's so easy to get sidetracked. And then suddenly, I mean, you've like abandoned that flow. You haven't finished that purchase or whatever, like you haven't reached that point. And like, this is, so just taking people out of that flow is extremely costly.
Yeah, my thing is, look, it was just never purpose built for identity, right? SMS was built as a way to communicate with other people and not, verify identity. So it's, it gets a bit of a bad rap. I do think the coverage is the element that's going to keep SMS OTP around for a couple more years, right? And user familiarity. It comes down to those two things, like universal coverage, and people understand how to, open up their phone and navigate to their texting app. And it's just a level of familiarity that may not be as prevalent with other things. But, I'm sure people were a little shocked when Touch ID came out, Face ID came out. People weren't familiar with that sort of user experience. And I think it changes over time. But let's take a step back and let's think about, what should you focus on then for authentication, right? And so this is something we spend a lot of time thinking through at Prove, right? So what so actually, let me take a step back. So something you are, something you have, and then something those three are the three legs of a stool for strong customer authentication, right? So the EU is pushing this, and something is pretty corruptible. It's pretty easy to get around. I'm sure our information is out there floating on the dark web, and it's just cumbersome. Like the amount of times you've probably showed up at a site to do something or make a purchase, and you've come across like, okay, what's my password? I don't know. I need to go open up my password manager and figure it out, right? I had that issue today. The laptop I planned to use for the webinar died, so I was issued a new work laptop, and I had to go into my old Chrome keychain to pull out the password from like LastPass and input it into my Gmail on my new laptop. Because what did I do? I didn't think of a password. I just let, the keychain brainstorm a password for me that was like 20 characters, and I saved it on there, right? So it's just super cumbersome. But at Prove, we're moving in the direction of focusing on something you have and something you are. And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, these have always been like the three pillars of authentication. Something something you have, something you are. The real story here is that, for the longest time, for a very long time, authentication was only that first category. It was only something It was like things like passwords, and then, or even things like your social security number, your date of birth, your mother's maiden name, those type of things. More recently, something you have kind of came after that, where you had things like RSA secure ID, physical tokens, things like that. And then something you are, like the biometrics, that's a more recent phenomenon. I think the first, the time it really took off is with things like Touch ID for fingerprints. That was really the first time that you just had a widespread adoption of biometrics for authentication. And then more recently, things like behavioral biometrics. So it's not just static things like your fingerprint or your face, but things that are dynamic and in the way that you do behavior. Now, these, much like SMS OTP, like SMS OTP is going to be around for a very long time, and like the usage is going to drop, but it's still going to be around for a long time. Same thing here. Passwords are not going away anytime soon. They will still exist. It'll just be much more. There's just much more rich tapestry of techniques, of authentication techniques, and you'd be using many different of these factors together. I think ultimately the ones that are going to win out are going to be the ones that don't require the user to do anything different. I mean, you don't have to train the user, have them change their behavior, or, have them do something new, have them carry something extra around. That's the actual hard part. I mean, this has been true. You just look through technology, right? Like the history of technology. Always at the beginning, technology is rather limited, and then people had to adapt to the limitations of technology. And then eventually, but technology increases, like the pace that technology improves is much faster than the pace that, humans can change their behavior. And so so eventually what happens is that technology gets good enough that it can then adapt to human behavior the way that they are. And just leading to just much more natural and honestly more human interactions with technology. And the same thing is happening in the authentication space, where just the way that it used to be that the way you prove your identity is that you tell someone a password, or you have some secret that you tell them that secret, and then that's how they know that it's you. Or maybe you have something physical that you have. I'm in possession of this, and I'm going to keep really close. I promise I'm not going to lose this thing, and nobody's going to steal it or whatever. And then that's how you can prove your identity. These increasingly this is just becoming more identity and authentication, and becoming more like it was in prehistoric times. I mean, basically, how do you identify somebody back then, right? It's like you look at their face and their voice and their behavior, and like there's a lot of different things that come together to do that. And I think that's the direction that these things are going, just to honestly just become a much more natural forms of authentication. And then this is where all that friction kind of drops away. That's
a good segue. So, as you talk about how things have changed over time, right? So, I made this up. So maybe what MFA 1.0 other people think is not what I think it is. But the way I think about it is, you've got email on one side of the spectrum, and then on the other side of the spectrum, you've got some of the technologies that are in use today. So kind of walk us through this, right? And in the middle, you'll see the fortified OTPs that have come about, right? If you're sending an SMS OTP, well, you should do some additional checks, figure out the reputation of the phone number that you're dealing with, see if there's been a recent SIM swap, right? And so this is stuff we work on today and our customers use, which is, fortified OTPs, but the puck is going elsewhere, right? And we want to make sure that our clients are staying ahead of the curve. So what do you see in MFA 3.0?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a good framework. I mean, the other part of MFA 1.0, I think, is, there are things like RSA secure ID, kind of like going like, physical tokens when, those kind of, as well as like, things like email as well, SMS OTP, a little bit more recent. And I mean, I don't like this notion of like the fortified OTP. It's not really, maybe that's like a MFA 2.5 or maybe like a 2.1. I mean, it's like it's a slight kind of, it's like a Band-Aid on top of that, just to kind of try to shore up some of those limitations and things like, the delivery mechanism of those OTPs to be slightly more, confident that they're being delivered correctly, and they're not being intercepted, et cetera. They're like, as you go into the future, more and more of this, the identity and these identity flows are going to be centered around some device you already have, like, and it's going to really be the phone. And I think you're starting to see this with things like WebAuthn, where, you can incorporate, authentication on your phone to authenticate into websites on the computer, right? In a pretty seamless way. And, there's a lot of benefits to that, just in terms of, this is a device that you have that you control. And, and so to actually hack this, you're going, like, it becomes a much more involved process than just having like some remote access agent on the computer, or, just taking over one device. Now you have to do this across multiple devices. Android and iOS have done a pretty good job at at securing these types of devices. I mean, they definitely learned a lot through the experience with kind of desktop computers and everything in terms of architecturally. Like these are pretty good, and there's a lot, and of course there always are 0-day vulnerabilities, and there's always there's ways to jailbreak and those kind of things. But the security is actually pretty good. I mean, and because they learned, they built it in from the beginning, and they learned a lot, from from prior experience about how to architect the system to be much more secure. So there's a lot of great security features on the phone. So I think there's a lot of these authentication flows are going to be going through the phone. Things like push-based authentication has become really big. I mean,
I think that's a big driver, right? Like what we're seeing is that hardware is finally catching up, right? Over 80% of devices are now compatible with biometrics. We're probably over 95% of devices that have a trustable, secure element now, right? That wasn't even true 36 months ago, right? So I think the rapid pace of innovation and hardware security is really unlocking a lot of these MFA 3.0 use cases, right? And so, for example, one that didn't rely on improved hardware is something we already do today at Prove, which is mobile authentication. We can resolve the phone number of a user that's in a digital session with a client passively behind the scenes, right? But because hardware has started to improve, you're starting to see a ton of startups that are offering up passwordless login as their primary offering. And that's going to have a huge moment, I think, in the next couple of years. I think moving away from passwords will be a big thing, but the technology that powers the passwordless login use case is really push authentication. And it comes down to dropping a token onto a secure element of a device, right? So the HSM, the hardware security module on an iPhone, is finally at the level that we can trust dropping in a token and going back in there and saying, hey, is that token still there in future interactions? And if it's there, you can actually trust that that token was not tampered with and that the device is still the same device that you interacted with last time. So I think that, there's several players now in push authentication. We see a ton of our peers. We have a sister company, Hyper. We see Beyond Identity. We share we share an investor with Hyper. We see Beyond Identity all the time. So there are a ton of other companies out there that are tackling passwordless login, Trusona, and others. So there's a ton of movement there. But what I want to talk to you about really is what you guys were working on at UnifyID, which is behavior biometrics, right? Because I think that's where the years and years of research you guys were doing really helped you guys come up with something new.
Yeah. I mean, and just for some background, like what is like behavioral biometrics? I mean, first of all, what's biometrics? I mean, biometrics is like measuring something unique about like the person, about the human, right? And there, I think that like there are a lot of vendors. I mean, behavioral biometrics is a very hot area right now. There's a lot of vendors that are talking about behavioral biometrics and claiming it, that they do some form of behavioral biometrics. The thing that we do that's really unique is that we make an SDK for iOS and Android that can actually run in the background. So it can actually monitor users' behavior even when you're not actively using the app or interacting with the service. And so that because of that, we can actually get very high levels of accuracy, on par with a physical fingerprint, based on things, using factors like somebody's gait, like the way that they walk. For example, it turns out that the way that people walk is very unique to them, and it's based on, their unique physiology and muscle memory and a bunch of other things that. But it turns out that is actually very unique to each individual. So with our technology, for example, I mean, once we've built a model for a user, within the order of 5 to 10 seconds of walking, we can then re-identify that user to say that, hey, this is actually John, who's carrying this phone and walking with this phone, just based on the motion associated with gait. And, there's a lot of other things that, if you think about on these devices, how many sensors are on these devices and how many things you can get access to in the background, things like your location, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, like these things even have barometers in them, and all there's a lot of sensors on these things. And you by being able to access these in the background, you can actually build a pretty reliable model of somebody's behavior and then use that for authentication, which is really the difference, I think, for just about every other case, when you're talking about behavioral biometrics, they're focused on risk and fraud, fraud detection type of use cases, just because they're not, they're looking at behavior. Like it's the type of thing, it's like, well, let's look at behavior. Does this behavior look suspicious in some way? Does this behavior, does it look like this is like somebody in a click farm somewhere that's like cutting and pasting forms and filling them in? Does it look like a bot or a human? Or maybe it's like just small pieces of information about like, how does somebody type, or how does somebody scroll, or these type of things. These are all just very small bits of information. They have a very high false positive rate. And so you can't really use them to say definitively, like, who is the person behind the device. And that's really the difference of what we're doing, is that because the type of factors we use and the fact we can run in the background and have these machine learning models that map your behavior, we can actually tell with a fairly high degree of certainty, like, who is the actual person behind the device, without the person having to do anything.
Yeah. And I think that was what really prompted our conversations, because, as you look at the axes at the bottom, right, there's security, friction, and, I would add a third, that we're moving from just identifying attributes about people or their device to then actually confirming it is the person we are looking for behind that device, right? So that's a good segue into the next question that I have for you. So these are just a couple stats. I think one thing that I'd like to say on how big the market is, I think the market is way bigger than anyone imagines, because if identity were easier for developers to implement, right? If identity tooling was easier to use, I think way more developers would integrate it into their applications, right? I think in many cases, people just skip the identity step, especially if they're, lower risk transactions. But I think what will happen is we'll start to see developers that work on products and applications that are even lower risk think about using identity as a way to unlock value, right? You mentioned this earlier, right? Like, how does this identity issue hurt your revenue? Well, every time you ask a user to stop and do something on a journey to purchasing or interacting with your service, you're hurting your chances of converting that user into revenue. So first off, I think the market is way bigger than anyone imagines. I think we would just have way more engineers building identity seamlessly into applications if it was easier to use. But beyond that, right, we spent some time talking about behavioral biometrics. I'd love to know your take on why now. You've been working on this problem for over 5 years now, right? So why do you think behavioral biometrics is having its moment now? And we have tier 1 banks that come to us and say, well, we looked at behavioral biometrics 3 years ago, 4 years ago, it wasn't ready at that time. So why do you think we're having a moment now for behavioral biometrics?
I think there's three parts of that. Number one is that the problem has gotten much worse. Even compared to a year ago. If you look just across during the time of the pandemic, 90% of organizations saw increased, cyber attacks against them, and most of these are around credentials and identity authentication. And now, when more and more people are working remotely, this is a much stronger reason to have a need for remote authentication. Like there used to be a lot of context where it's like, well, I'm authenticated because I'm physically here. It's like I'm physically in the building. There's physical security on the building. You can see me. There's like some implicit authentication that's happening there. Like when you're interacting with somebody remotely, like you don't have that, and so you need to have some other forms of authentication. So and attacks have gotten much worse. There's for a variety of reasons, including, it's depending on how the economy goes. Like typically when the economy gets worse, then like the number of these type of attacks spike. Just as a purely economic side as well, and they're very, very lucrative. They're fraud. This type of fraud. Ransomware and everything else is like these are booming industries, and they're industries. They're true businesses that are huge. So all of this put together, the problem is so much worse. Not to mention for end users, they're now faced with, okay, well, how am I going to manage all these different accounts on these different services, and to use a password manager? Like you mentioned, okay, do I use the Chrome some Chrome plugin or, some built-in support for that. And then, but then of course, like you now switch to a new device and then I have to go and look that up. It's just, it's just a mess. And like that, like the problem is it's become untenable. Like it cannot, it cannot continue the way it is. So that's number one. There's a huge driver on that side, right? Number two is the fact that there are now these kind of very, great sources of data. The fact that people carry these things around all the time, that is, that's a great, like opportunity for identity and authentication. The fact that these devices exist, the fact that they have pretty good security and they're and you carry around them around all the time. The fact there's so many sensors on these devices that you can, not just things like cameras and microphones, but the pressure sensors and the way you touch the screen and like the accelerometer and gyroscope and these things, these are all extremely valuable for doing this, this type of authentication. And then the third reason is really technology. This is, the fact that, now you can take, millions of users' data, put it together into a machine learning model and build something that is as accurate as a physical fingerprint based on somebody's motion. 10 years ago, this was just not, it was not technically possible. Like there wasn't enough data and there wasn't enough like GPU power to go and crunch and build those neural networks and everything. Now there are, now there is. And like we do a lot of work, not only just, on machine learning side, but also like on device machine learning. And then, the fact that the devices are now powerful enough to be able to do machine learning on your actual device, as well as like just a lot of innovations on the machine learning side. So it's really like the combination of those together. And I mean, this is naturally the direction that authentication is going. Right. Like there, 5 to 10 years ago, there were just, there was no capability to be able to say, is this John, without John having to going and do something, explicit or like look into a camera or put a finger on a fingerprint reader or type in a password. Right.
Right.
Now it is now the technology is, the capability exists. And so this is this is where this is the direction that things are going.
Yeah. So I guess to summarize, the first is the problem continues to grow, right? Password fatigue, increased hacks during COVID. Number two, we've got something that's universally carried around by people, right? We actually have something that can be used to authenticate you that you carry around 24/7, right? And then three, advancements in machine learning. So I think those are all great points. So why don't we talk a little bit about what are some of the best practices if you're out there looking to build a modern MFA, architecture for your company. And so, to just touch on what you just said about behavioral biometrics, I think a bunch of the tier one banks and fintechs that we've spoken to agree that the confluence of factors you mentioned are why behavioral biometrics is having its moment. And we know, several major players that are going to be rolling out behavioral biometrics into their applications and into their products within the next 12 to 14 months. So as people think about modern MFA and maybe how they would involve behavioral biometrics, walk us through some of the best practices.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, knowledge-based authentication. I mean, these are things. This includes things like passwords, also security questions. Questions based on public records and like these type of things. We're now in the era of the data breach, and there are more, and the number of data breaches are just going up. I mean, they're just going to increase. And so, a strict reliance on this type of KBA or like a knowledge-based authentication, whether it be passwords or security questions or anything, need to start to move away from these, or at the very least supplement them with other forms of authentication. Just because, I mean, they're just very unreliable. I mean, like at one point in time, like your social security number was pretty private. Nowadays, not so much. I mean, especially think about, Equifax breach, like
Yeah,
literally.
or every form
Yeah.
you ever fill out at any new doctor you visit. I feel like every time I see a doctor's office, I'm writing down my social security number, and there's just no way they've got the data security,
Yep.
sophistication. So, I mean,
and once they're leaked, I mean, they're burned. I mean, you can no longer use them for reliable authentication. And this information is like, it's not a question of if, it's like, it's a question of when. And I think at this point, basically just going across all the data breaches, the vast majority of people in the US have had their data leaked, and it's in, it's on the dark web somewhere, it's leaked somewhere. So, and even for things that are not like that, a very basic amount of research can often, uncover these type of answers. So, like, although like the knowledge-based authentication will continue to stick around for a while, like that cannot be the predominant method of authentication anymore. And so you have to start to move away from that, right?
Yeah, and I think we've talked about the second and the third bullets, to an extent in the prior slide. So tell me about how to use a phone as an omni-channel authenticator. What do we really mean by that?
I mean, this is like, when you're thinking about authentication, don't just think about it in terms of like just one context of one service. Like, how am I going to log into this web page? Like, that's like, the truth is now, many and more of these interactions are becoming omni-channel. Like, it's not I may interact through the web. I may also interact through, through a mobile app on the phone, through mobile web, through SMS or some type of texting interface, social media, like physical location, call center, contact center, like all of these, you should really think of identity in a more holistic way. And then how are you going to seamlessly authenticate people regardless of what channel that they come through, right?
Yeah, the phone is like, to me, right? Like, and I'm not as technical as you, but I think of the phone as like a smart YubiKey now, right? You've got the security of a YubiKey in the vault that's on the phone in the HSM. And when you're logging into a web page, I understand 2FA, but what I would prefer is if I just got a push notification on my phone that I just tap OK on, a single tap way to access my account, right? Without having to take a code, read the code, punch it in onto my desktop. I think that's where the disjointed friction gets annoying, right? You're logging in from your desktop and you get pushed something on your phone. Well, you can't use the handy copy paste feature that Apple has, right? When you're getting when you're getting an SMS and you're using that one-time code to log in on your mobile. So it becomes disjointed, it gets annoying. So, the phone as almost like a smart YubiKey that you have on you at all times. I view that as a huge plus. But what do you mean by authenticating users before they're in session, right? Like, define in session and then tell me what you mean.
Yeah. So in session means basically I'm already interacting with your service, right? Maybe I've logged in, I'm starting to type things, I've started to move my mouse around, scroll, like navigate through the service. The truth is that usually by that time it's too late. Like, I mean, usually when you are authenticating, like you authenticate sometime in the beginning, you need to authenticate sometime near the beginning. And then once you're in the service, then you can, then you'll start to interact there. If you're only looking at data that's within the session, you just do not have enough visibility and data into what the user's actually doing or whether it's the correct user or not. And so this is where it becomes important to be able to authenticate, have some information about the user even before they have logged in, so that you can get some visibility and risk signals about the user before they've actually gone through the login process. Because once they go through the login process, that's often it's like too little, too late at that point, because you have a short window, and you also have a very small amount of data to work with. The ideal situation is that whether by the time they kind of hit your website, or they walk into the banking branch, or they're making that phone call, you should know with a fairly high certainty, whether this is the correct user or not at that time, rather than 5 minutes into the call or 10 minutes into the session, or a week later would have flagged as like, hey, maybe this seemed like it was like maybe anomalous or something.
Yeah.
So
And I think motion. So kudos to you guys for thinking about motion, because using motion as a lead-in to do a pre-session authentication, I think is pretty clever. And the last bullet here, and we're kind of running short on time. We have 15 minutes left, so I want to kind of get through these. But authenticating the person behind the device. I think we've spent a good amount of time on this in the earlier slides, but that is just a totally different level than just looking at the device and establishing trust with the device, right?
Yeah, and this is going to be very important. I mean, just because people use multiple devices. I mean, and they move from one device to a new device, and so what you really like I mentioned, you'll interact with a brand or a company or service like via different channels, right? And so this is why you can't just rely on the device. People upgrade their phones, people, get new computers like you just did, where you need to set it up. So you cannot rely that purely on a device signal to authenticate the user. You really need to start to look the human behind the device, just because like people swap devices and come in through different channels.
Yeah. So let's move on. And we've talked about SMS OTPs, what's going to happen there. I bet that SMS OTPs still hang around for a bit because of the coverage and user familiarity that we mentioned earlier. But, if you're trying to give your users the best experience and security, this is something that you should think about phasing out over the coming years. And so we've got a bunch of use cases here, but we don't have enough time to cover all of them. I mean, we only intended to pick one or two that we thought were interesting. And I think the one use case here that's really enabled by advancements in behavioral biometrics is the promotions fraud detection, right? So talk to us about that. Right? You've got a ton of interest on promotion fraud detection.
Yeah, I mean, these are from the kind of like the biggest like ride sharing companies, food delivery, shopping, like et cetera, like those type of, especially sharing economy companies, but really a lot of and others mobile apps where they really prioritize, real ease of user onboarding. And then they often, as part of a user acquisition strategy, they invest a lot into promotions. I mean, things like, the first time you sign up, you get a free ride, you get a $5 off coupon, like that, those type of things.
A lot of burning VC money. So yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, they care a lot about this. I mean, this directly connects to their all the metrics that they care about, right? And so I mean and promotions fraud is a real thing, and it's very widespread. And so these among these companies, and so they're using behavior. What you can do is like if there's somebody who has been banned from your platform, you've identified them before, and then they come back in under a different account. Like that, this may be with a different phone number on a different device, a different email address, or even under a different identity. And then, but the one constant there is their behavior. And so, using our technology, we have a technology called Behavior Print that actually allows you to, when a new user signs up, you can actually detect, hey, we've seen this user before, and maybe this is a user you've previously flagged and said, hey, like they were like, it looks like this is a duplicate account. And so we're working with, some of the top brands on that side, especially on the sharing economy side, but like, in a number of other industries as well, to help with the promotions fraud problem, detecting cases where you have duplicate accounts or people signing up multiple times.
Yeah, it's interesting to use motion to tackle promotions fraud, right? That's typically not the angle that people have taken. But let's take a look at a short demo.
Hi, I'm John Whaley, founder and CEO of UnifyID, and today I'm going to show you a demonstration of UnifyID's passive authentication technology. UnifyID makes a mobile SDK for iOS and Android that can authenticate users passively based on their motion and behavior. The accuracy is very high, and it doesn't require the user to do anything different. Just be yourself, and there's enough that's unique about you that we can actually authenticate you. You can use UnifyID's passive authentication in any case where you need security but want to have a seamless user experience, not just on the phone, but on other devices as well. Now, one of the worst authentication experiences is when you need to dial into a call center. So we've integrated UnifyID into a banking application on my phone. I've been in possession of my device this entire time. Let's see what happens when I dial into the call center.
Hello, John. Thank you for calling in from a known phone. One question, how can we help you today?
So with UnifyID, we know not only what device the call is coming from, but who is the person who's holding that device, leading to a much more streamlined user experience. Now let me put my phone down on the table, and I'll intentionally not pick it up and try to dial again.
To protect the security of your account, we need to ask you some outdated questions that any hacker could answer. What is your date of birth? Could you verify the last time you made a purchase with us?
No. See, that is the typical call center experience. Now let me pick up the phone, I'm gonna walk around a few steps and try to dial again.
Hello, John. Thank you for calling in from a known phone. One question, how can we help you today?
Now, how did that work? Well, we're using two signals here, your unique gait and motion, and also detecting when the phone's put down or out of your possession. It turns out your motion is unique enough that we can actually authenticate users with the same accuracy as a physical fingerprint based purely on their unique motion. And because it runs in the background, you don't need to be walking all the time or even have the app open or the phone unlocked. We can use motion data from 5, 10, 15 minutes ago and use that to make an authentication decision. This allows you to understand much more about the context and what the user is doing and incorporate that into an adaptive authentication policy. So this is just one example of how to use UnifyID's passive authentication service to authenticate users in a much more seamless way.
Awesome. So if people want to learn more about that, feel free to reach out to me or John. I'm sure we'll circulate our emails after this webinar, but we only have 10 minutes left. So I want to go into the Q&A. So we've got a couple questions in. The first question is, why won't enterprises just build their own push authentication? Right. And so this is not behavioral biometrics. We're talking about push authentication, which is one of the techniques you can use to move beyond SMS OTP. So why not just build it yourself, John?
Yeah. So there's a lot of there are a lot of interesting corner cases around push authentication. It seems rather simple, right? It's like I go to a website, I type in my username, my password. Instead of sending an SMS, you send a push notification, and then somebody responds to that like within the app. That's the basic flow, right? But it's really hard to get the security right. There's a lot of tricky edge cases, corner cases where, okay, you have multiple devices. Okay, what do you do in those cases? Multiple devices are registered. Some device was lost. Like, how do you handle those type of cases? Like correctly leveraging the secure element and getting like the signing and encryption right. Like these things, like you can have a bug in there and not realize it, and then have your entire system be exposed. So I would not recommend like anyone where this is not your core competency, like don't do this. And by the way, there's plenty of solutions out there. We build a push auth solution, but as you mentioned, there's Hyper and there's Duo, and like there's a dozen other vendors that have great solutions on this side. So don't try to roll your own and build your own. Just leverage the work that's already done.
Yeah, and I think it's like doing plumbing work, right? Like, why would you want your developers focused on security when they could be working on the core value prop of whatever it is that you offer the market? So I think that's a great point. And, working with one of the companies you mentioned or us, I think it's interesting because we can compile the learnings we have from other customers or, edge cases that we see and learn from other customers. I know in our solution, we also apply machine learning to look at things such as environment-based signals, as well as device-based software and hardware metadata. So, we'll look at things like, does this person frequent this location? Where is their location right now? What are the Bluetooth networks around them? Wi-Fi networks around them? Are those typical of where they should be? And then things like device metadata, right? So if you're all of a sudden showing up with like iOS 10, that'd be pretty weird when you've always come in from a phone that's, iOS 13, 14. So things like that, I think the space is moving towards and improving on. So definitely wouldn't recommend building something like this on your own. Let's see what other questions. We have a question for you on the motion stuff. What if someone like breaks their leg? John, what do you do with a model if someone breaks their leg?
Yeah, I mean, look, yeah, obviously. So number one, if people are not moving and walking, like you don't have any signal there. So like this is why you need to you can't just rely on one factor. You have to rely on multiple factors. And, we do something called perennial learning, which basically tracks people's behavior over time. So if there's some type of sudden change, it won't authenticate as a user. You'll need to do some type of step up authentication or other thing to verify their identity at that point. But like once you've done that a couple of times, then it just learns like, oh, actually, here's the new user's behavior, and then that feeds back into the machine learning model for the user. There's a per user model that is built for each individual user to say what makes them unique compared to anyone else in the world, and then that there's opportunity there for learning is not a one-time thing. You can do it continuously, and then use that to track people's behavior over time.
Got it. And when we were doing diligence on you guys, one of the things that we liked is that, and this is also going to answer one of the questions that came in, is that we can figure out if someone else has picked up the device, right? So when you put down the device, your algorithms reset, and when someone else picks up the device, it begins to gather data. But other things we can also see are like, if someone else picks up the device, how did they unlock your phone to access a service, right? Did they punch in their passcode? Did they use Face ID to then log into your account? So there are ways around that. So, I mean, I want to move towards this next question though, because I think it's pretty interesting. It forces us to step back from the discussion we're having. And the question is, what else is interesting in identity? Who's an identity player that we don't typically think about as an identity player? And I'll start, but I think the payroll guys, everyone overlooks the guys that are creating payroll APIs, right? So you've got Pinwheel out there, you've got Varix, which just rebranded as Wage, and you've got Truework and others. And all these guys have raised a ton of money. But I think payroll data is incredible for identity, because if you made it on to payroll, that means you went through like an I-9, a physical document check. You went through a bunch of hoops to get onto a employer's payroll system. So I think that's a huge treasure trove of identity. The interesting thing there, like the conundrum, is I have no idea what my payroll login is. So if you're using a provider that's, asking you to OAuth into payroll, I think, it's got to become a little simpler than that. But when you make it simpler, you default to KBA, right? Like, what's simpler than that? Can you find payroll data using your social security and your date of birth? Well, that's not the best defense up front to get into such rich identity data. But I think, those guys that are in that space are making real waves.
And I mean, not just that space. I mean, basically any case where you have like a sizable user base and kind of identity pool of identity, like you're going to see more and more of these kind of maybe non-traditional identity vendors be able to start to leverage those in interesting ways. Because there's real value in there, and so there's going to be a lot of consolidation that's happening, and a lot of partnerships and the kind of working together to be able to leverage some of these like traditional places where they may have a large user base. You don't really think of them as identity player, but they're going to be able to leverage those for identity in different contexts.
Coinbase has a separate app now. It's like a Coinbase wallet app, right? And they're trying to make your identity portable, which is interesting. So I think the nuance there, though, is if you have a large user base, you also need to have verified that user base, that other people trust your verification, right? So with Coinbase, I'm sure they're still doing document scans and making people jump through other hoops, address verifications. So if you are going to then make that identity portable, right, you've got to make sure that it was a trustworthy verification to begin with. That's why Facebook and login with Google is not an identity verification event. It's not like just because I have a Facebook account and then I connect to a service, right? I OAuth using Facebook. I mean, that doesn't mean you did an identity verification.
No, certainly, and obviously there's a lot of fake accounts and those types of things as well. But you do see, Google trying to leverage these Twitter trying to leverage these, Facebook, obviously, Apple and others, all trying to leverage these in various ways. They're up, and I think there's going to be a lot of things where, they do have, to your point, they have done that strong identity verification, and they've done that for kind of a fairly large set of users, and they're now able to leverage that in very interesting ways.
Yeah. Well, look, we're up on time and we have over a dozen questions to go. So what I would suggest is that we'll circulate our contact information after this webinar. Thank you guys all for joining. We'll send around our info, and please send us your questions, and we're happy to chat offline about just identity in general, Proof's offerings, what UnifyID has done in the space. But we're really excited to continue doing a webinar like this, hopefully every month or so.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of the questions that came up, I mean, they could actually be entire webinars themselves, like a lot of interesting stuff.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you all for joining. We'll send out our contact information after, but that's it for now. Thank you, guys.